In 1999, 12 European nations abandoned their individual currencies and adopted a single one, the euro. It was framed as the most ambitious economic unification in modern history, a path to stability, prosperity, and continental solidarity. But today, more than 2 decades later, a growing body of economists, historians, and policy analysts argue that for southern Europe, most visibly Italy and Greece, the euro has not been a ladder upward. It has been a cage. Italy's economy has grown by an average of just 0.8% annually since joining the Eurozone in 1999. Greece lost 26% of its GDP per capita in just 5 years, between 2008 and 2013. Youth unemployment in Greece peaked at over 60% during the crisis years and still stands at nearly 25% today. These are not footnotes. They are the defining economic realities of a generation. So what exactly is the hidden cost of the euro for southern Europe? Before the euro, Italy had the lira. Greece had the drachma. When their economies overheated or lost competitiveness, their governments had a powerful lever at their disposal: currency devaluation. By weakening the lira or the drachma, exports became cheaper overnight, tourism surged, and manufacturing regained its edge against foreign competition. It was blunt, imperfect, but it worked. When both countries adopted the euro, they surrendered that lever permanently. Monetary policy, interest rates, money supply, exchange rate was handed to the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, an institution designed to serve the needs of the entire Eurozone. The problem is that the Eurozone's needs are not uniform. What works for Germany does not work for Greece. Germany's export sector is concentrated in capital goods, industrial machinery, pharmaceutical chemicals, premium automobiles. These products compete on engineering precision and technological specification, not price. A 10% appreciation in the euro does not cause the American aerospace buyer to replace an Airbus turbine with a Chinese equivalent. Buyers of German industrial equipment compete on capability. Price is secondary. Italy's traditional export industries, fashion, ceramics, furniture, processed food, competed directly on price with manufacturers in China and across Asia. Their competitive position was acutely sensitive to the exchange rate, and the euro, calibrated to the aggregate weight of the Eurozone, was structurally overvalued for them. By the mid-2000s, Italy had lost approximately 25% of its price competitiveness against its Eurozone trading partners. With no exchange rate adjustment available, there was only one remaining mechanism. Wages would have to fall, and the domestic economy would have to shrink. Italy's export problem would be solved by making Italian workers poorer. Italy began adjusting without devaluation. The adjustment did not look like a crisis. It looked like a very long, very quiet decline. Between 1995 and 2008, Italian governments ran continuous primary budget surpluses, meaning they collected more in taxes than they spent before accounting for interest payments on their debt. That surplus averaged 3% of GDP every year for over a decade. According to the IMF, Italy followed the Eurozone's fiscal rules more strictly than France, and in most years, more strictly than Germany itself. The reward for that discipline was stagnation. Without the ability to devalue its currency and with deficit spending tightly constrained by the Stability and Growth Pact, Italy had no economic tool left to stimulate growth when it needed one. Business investment stalled. Innovation slowed. The country's industrial base, made up overwhelmingly of small and medium-sized enterprises, could not access the capital or the scale required to move up the technological ladder, to compete on quality and innovation rather than on price alone. Productivity growth, which is the single most reliable driver of rising living standards over time, turned negative, and real wages followed. The numbers that resulted are striking. Italy is the only country in the entire OECD where the average worker earns less today in real purchasing power than they did in 1990. Not less than at the peak of the boom years, not less than before the financial crisis. Less than 1990. The Italian worker in 2025 takes home less than the Italian worker did before the Maastricht Treaty for the euro was even signed. Every other comparable economy, France, Germany, Spain, the United States, saw real wages rise over that period. Italy's went in the opposite direction. That data point rarely appears in mainstream political discussions about the euro. it arguably should be the starting point for all of them. What Italy experienced between 1999 and 2015 has a name in economics. It is called internal devaluation. When a country cannot adjust its exchange rate to become more competitive, it adjusts everything else instead. Wages are pushed down, public services are cut, domestic consumption contracts. The exchange rate stays fixed. The cost of that stability is absorbed by workers and households rather than by the currency itself. For Italy, that process was slow and grinding, playing out over 15 quiet years of stagnation. For Greece, the same process was compressed into just 5 years. And unlike Italy, Greece did not experience it through market forces alone. It arrived in the form of creditors with conditions attached. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, the structural cracks became visible. Greece had been running large budget deficits throughout the 2000s, concealed by questionable accounting and sustained by cheap borrowing costs, a direct benefit of Eurozone membership that, paradoxically, had also made the reckoning worse when it came. By 2010, Greece's debt had become unsustainable. Bond markets panicked. Borrowing costs surged. And the solution imposed by the European Commission, the ECB and the IMF, known collectively as the Troika, was a brutal program of fiscal austerity in exchange for bailout funds. Between 2010 and 2018, Greece received €288.7 billion in financial assistance across 3 successive programs. It was the largest sovereign rescue operation in modern financial history. The conditions attached to that assistance were specific and severe. Public sector wages were cut. Pensions were reduced repeatedly. The healthcare budget contracted. Collective bargaining protections were dismantled. Taxes rose on a population whose income was simultaneously declining. The result was catastrophic. Real GDP per capita in Greece fell by 25% between 2008 and 2013. Overall unemployment reached 28% at its peak. Youth unemployment reached 62.5% in February 2013, meaning roughly 6 in 10 Greeks under 25 who wanted to work could not find it. Hundreds of thousands of young, educated Greeks relocated to Germany, the United Kingdom, and Australia. A demographic loss from which the country's labour force has not recovered. The average monthly salary in Greece today remains roughly 20% below what it was before the crisis. The tragedy is that this austerity, demanded as a condition of remaining in the Eurozone, deepened the very recession it was meant to cure. Without the ability to devalue the currency or run stimulative monetary policy, Greece could only suffer through what economists call internal devaluation, making the economy competitive by making its people poorer. Italy played a different role in the same story. After 1992, successive Italian governments ran continuous primary budget surpluses, spending less than they received in taxes, excluding interest payments, averaging 3% of GDP per year between 1995 and 2008. Italy followed the Eurozone's fiscal rulebook more strictly than France or Germany. It was rewarded with stagnation. Economists at the Institute for New Economic Thinking concluded that Italy's adherence to the EMU rulebook asphyxiated its domestic demand and exports, resulting not just in stagnation but in relative and absolute decline across nearly every major dimension of economic activity. The numbers tell a story of divergence that is striking in its scale. Until the early 1990s, Italy was closing the economic gap with France and Germany. By the mid-1990s, Italian GDP per capita had reached 97% of French per capita income, almost equal. Since then, it has fallen steadily. By 2018, the gap was wider than it had been in 1960. Italian GDP per capita now sits at roughly 76% of comparable Northern European economies. This is not the result of laziness or mismanagement alone. It is the result of an economic architecture that was never designed for economies like Italy's. Germany benefited from the euro in a way that Italy simply could not. Germany's export sector is dominated by capital goods, cars, industrial machinery, pharmaceuticals, where quality and technological leadership matter more than price. A strong euro barely dents German export volumes. Italy's traditional industries, fashion, ceramics, furniture, food, compete heavily on price and were devastated by an exchange rate suited to German industrial might. Business investment in Italy stagnated for years. Innovation fell behind. The country's manufacturing sector, made up overwhelmingly of small and medium-sized enterprises, struggled to access credit, scale up, or compete globally. Productivity growth, which drives long-term prosperity, slowed almost to zero and eventually turned negative. For Greece, the damage was different but equally lasting. Tourism and shipping, the economy's twin pillars, survived, but the country's industrial base, never strong, was further hollowed out. Public debt, rather than falling as the austerity programs intended, oscillated near 150 to 160% of GDP as the shrinking economy constantly undermined the denominator of the debt ratio. Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio today stands at approximately 154%, still higher than almost anywhere else in the developed world. It would be incomplete to tell this story without acknowledging who benefited. Northern European economies, Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, gained enormously from a common currency that was structurally undervalued for their export-heavy, high-productivity economies. German exports boomed through the 2000s. Germany's current account surplus swelled to extraordinary levels, representing a structural imbalance within the Eurozone that directly corresponded to deficits in the south. The euro also benefited Southern Europe in one significant way. It delivered a decade of historically low borrowing costs. Before the euro, Italy and Greece paid high interest rates on their debt to compensate investors for currency risk. After joining, those rates fell dramatically. Italy's borrowing costs dropped close to German levels. But this gift was squandered. Cheap credit financed consumption and public spending rather than investment and structural reform. When the crisis came, the bill arrived all at once. The Eurozone, in short, transferred the risk of devaluation from currency markets to labour markets and public balance sheets. Instead of the exchange rate adjusting, wages had to fall, unemployment had to rise, and governments had to cut. The burden of adjustment fell not on financial capital, which remained protected within the single currency, but on workers, pensioners, and the unemployed. In recent years, the picture has shifted somewhat. Greece has posted some of the fastest growth rates in the EU, growing at 3.7% in 2024 and earning a return to investment-grade credit rating in 2023. Youth unemployment, while still at nearly 25%, is far below its crisis peak. A cautious optimism has returned to Athens, but perspective matters. Greece is recovering from a catastrophe. GDP per capita remains 44.9% below the European Union members' average. The average gross monthly wage is still 20% lower than it was in 2008. The country has simply not had enough time or economic headroom to undo the damage of the lost decade. Italy's situation is more structurally troubling. Growth remains stagnant. Business investment fell to 12.6% of GDP in 2024, declining even as the rest of Europe slowly recovered. Productivity remains stagnant. The country's debt stands at over 135% of GDP, high enough that rising interest rates threaten to consume an ever larger share of the public budget. The upcoming EU budget cycle is expected to reduce regional development funding, hitting economies like Italy and Greece hardest, while directing more resources toward defence and digital investment, sectors where Germany and France are better positioned. The euro was built on a political dream, that economic integration would bind Europe together, reduce the risk of war, and create a prosperous continent-wide market. That dream is not without merit. Trade within the Eurozone expanded significantly. Price transparency increased. The elimination of currency risk reduced friction for businesses and consumers alike. But dreams built without adequate foundations eventually crack. The Eurozone was launched without the fiscal union, the debt mutualization, or the robust transfer mechanisms that economists had long argued were necessary to make a single currency work across such diverse economies. Germany refused to become Europe's permanent creditor. Peripheral nations were left to absorb asymmetric shocks with their hands tied behind their backs. For Italy and Greece, the euro's hidden cost is measured not in abstract statistics, but in hollowed-out towns, emigrated youth, frozen wages, and a generation that reached adulthood in a country structurally unable to provide the opportunities they deserved. The euro has not been a disaster for Europe. But for its southern periphery, it has been something harder to explain. A currency that technically worked, while the economies around it quietly fell apart. Whether that price was worth the political and institutional gains of European integration will be debated for decades. But the numbers, the trends, and the human cost are already clear. Stability was promised. For millions of Italians and Greeks, what arrived instead was stagnation.